Okay, so last week we looked at gender and sexuality in Judaism and Islam, and tonight we'll turn to Christianity. Now, of course, it's a big ship, so I'm going to be speaking about some of the major trends historically, and things have changed quite a bit in terms of modernity, but it's important to know what the background was. So, I want to start with some comments related to Jesus and sexuality, both in terms of his attitudes towards sexuality and his own sexual status. So in terms of the Gospels, there's very little information about either. The only really sort of direct reference to sexuality can be found in Matthew 19, and I'll read it to you, because the disciples ask him about marriage and divorce. And he replies in a way that sort of holds up the sanctity of marriage as accepted in his time. He states, divorce is not allowed except in cases of adultery. That's for the female, not the male. And adds that whoever divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, and marries another, commits adultery. Uh-oh. How many of you were aware of that passage? Okay. And whoever marries her who is divorced commits adultery. Now we got to remember we're talking about a culture 2,000 years ago, okay? So, and this is why it's always important to know the context. Things do change. Okay, so on the one hand, actually this helped protect the female from an unjust divorce. On the other, it presented her within what is sometimes referred to as the seed paradigm, as the man's field to be plowed. That was the seed paradigm. And this supported traditional views of sexuality in Judaism. Then the disciples ask him, if such is the case of the man with his wife, is it better not to marry? And he gives an intriguing answer. This was his answer. All cannot accept this saying, but only those to whom it has been given. For there are eunuchs who were born thus from their mother's womb, and there are eunuchs who were made eunuchs by men, and there are eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven's sake. He who is able to accept it, let him accept it. So what was a eunuch? It's a castrated male. A eunuch is a castrated male. And in Jesus' time, it was associated with a number of things, either physical deformation, homosexuality, sexual license, as well as with the imperial administration associated with Rome. So the image is a little odd, to say the least, and would have no doubt confused the disciples, but they were often confused if you read the text. And probably many of his listeners, what's he saying in all of this? In addition, what is one to do with the reference to some eunuchs being born that way? So he said there was three classes. He said there was three types: born that way, made that way. That was usually with the imperial administration. Those males who were working in the harem with the women were castrated. And then, so, does it mean some men are born without the desire or ability to have sexual relations with a woman? One possible interpretation, and this was later rejected by later Christian orthodoxy, that it was a condition that homosexuality is a natural condition. But the primary significance of this passage for the tradition was that it became the cornerstone for defining Jesus' own sexuality or more accurately, lack thereof. For it identified him as a eunuch born thus from his mother's womb, the Virgin Mary. Which it took to mean not that Jesus was deformed physically, but that he was by nature asexual, non-sexual. And if you've ever seen, I don't think, have you ever seen an image of Jesus that relates to his being sexual at all? No. Contrast this with the image of Muhammad, because he had numerous wives. Okay, so it's very interesting, the difference in the way Jesus was viewed by his tradition and Muhammad was viewed by his tradition. Moreover, the tradition would go on to identify the third type of eunuch, those who have made themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven's sake. That's the third type. With those individuals whose spirituality was such that they chose celibacy. So those are the three references.
So no surgery involved, simply choice.
Choice, yeah. And castration took place in the second situation where male they were castrated so that they didn't have any potency with the harem.
But if they were the third type, man-made,
Yeah, no.
there wouldn't necessarily be surgery, simply a choice.
Yeah, and you see where that leads in the Christian tradition? Nuns and celibate priests. That's the source of that tradition. But I'll say more about that later. So now, if Jesus was indeed asexual, and that's how he's always presented, you never see any sexual aspects to him. How is it to be explained? For celibacy was not seen as a spiritual boon in the traditional Jewish tradition. You don't have celibacy. All rabbis should be married. It's part of the role of a rabbi. It was the opposite. If you look at all the Old Testament biblical heroes, they're all potent guys. From Solomon to David and it's sort of like Muhammad. And that was sort of the acceptance. So it's interesting, because the question then becomes, how does this image of Jesus come about? And we don't know. There are lots of different theories about it, but we're not quite sure. And there are no significant references in the eschatological tradition of the Messiah being ascetic. The Messiah wasn't going to be ascetic. He was a potent warrior. So it's very interesting how this image develops historically. And like I said, there are lots of different ideas about it. Because also, Jesus is referred to many times in the New Testament as a rabbi. He was, and there's still, that's how Jews tend to see Jesus. He was a rabbi, a great spiritual teacher. And so if he was a rabbi, which would have put him at the heart of the tradition, again, that doesn't fit very well. But three answers have emerged as likely candidates. First, Jesus was a rabbi who chose not to marry because of the nature of his calling. Okay, he didn't have time for family. Yeah. His mission was to prepare the Jews for the coming of the kingdom, and it did not allow him the time needed to perform normal filial duties. So that's been one explanation. He was a rabbi, but he chose not to get married because of his mission. But if this were the case, his lack of sexuality would have been practical rather than spiritual. It wasn't a question of a spiritual choice. It would have been a practical choice if that was the answer. Second, that Jesus was not a mainstream rabbi, but a member of this group, known as the Essenes. So who were the Essenes? I think we've mentioned them several times, and then Reverend Elbert has made reference, but let's go over it again. They were an ascetic community of Jews, small community, not mainstream, who lived outside of the major cities. They lived outside of Jerusalem. They lived in a place called Qumran, which was a number of miles from Jerusalem. They actually looked down upon mainstream Judaism as being spiritually lax and impure. This was a small community who lived down by the Dead Sea, if you've ever been to Israel. They emphasized the sinful nature of man, the need to repent, and the nearness of the end of time. This was three of their main views. In this regard, it's speculated by some scholars that John the Baptist may well have been an Essene. The images we have of him calling to repent, tell about sin, and how's he dressed? He's a wild man if you look at the images. So had Jesus been an Essene, this might explain his celibacy. That's a possible answer, because he would have had to take celibacy vows if you're a Essene. So what's the problem with these communities that take celibacy vows?
You don't grow.
You don't grow unless you're bringing in new people, because you're not going to produce within your own community. So, but it would also fit in with some of his anti-family statements. You know, there's this popular notion there was sometimes Jesus and family. But he said some pretty strong anti-family things, if you've ever read. Here's one. For I have come to set a man against his father, and a daughter against her mother, and a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. And a man's foes will be those of his own household. He who loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. And he who loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. Matthew 10:35-37. Then there were some of these apocalyptic references to the end of time, as in Mark 13:7-8. But when you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be troubled, for such things must happen, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places. There will be famine and troubles. These are the beginnings of sorrows, which has allowed just about any time in history for people to say this is the end time, because those things are continually happening. So those are the points that argue that he may have been an Essene, and if he was an Essene, why he would be asexual. There's a problem, however. He doesn't fit, the Jesus of the gospel really doesn't fit into the Essene profile, if you look at it closely. Because the Essenes looked down on what they considered the religiously undisciplined or sinners, seeing them as not being sufficiently pious or knowledgeable to be counted as worthy. Or what is Jesus always doing? According to the Gospels, he's always associating with sinners. That's one of the reasons they lived apart. They didn't want to be close to sinners. And that's not the image you get of Jesus in the Gospels, right? He's depicted as openly mixing with such people. There's the fact that the Essene life was open only to adult males, no females, whereas Jesus sought to include women in his ministry. And more significantly, the Essenes placed emphasis on purity and pollution, while Jesus continually criticized such ideas. So he probably wasn't an Essene. A third explanation perhaps is asexuality, is known as Gnosticism. And this might have been projected back onto Jesus' time. It was a religious position, both Christian and non-Christian, that was very widespread in the early centuries CE across the Mediterranean world. Essentially, it held that matter was evil. An attachment to it prevented the divine spark within from returning to its ultimate source. So it was dualistic. There's the evil body, there's the spiritual soul. The soul is captured within the body. The goal of life is to get your soul back to its spiritual source. So what would the attitude towards sex be? Sex would be the most attachment to the body one could have. So that would be rejected. So sexuality was by and large condemned or seen at best as a necessary evil performed by men whose animal nature was predominant. Most of us. So as an incarnation of divinity, Jesus would therefore be seen as asexual. So the view of the idea that Jesus was asexual may have come from these later Gnostic tendencies that developed both in early Christian communities and non-Christian communities. That's another possibility. But whatever the source, the belief in Jesus's asexuality became the official position of the early church. That was the position of the early church. Again, as compared to Moses or Muhammad in those other traditions. And this presented the problem of how to link the asexual Jesus, who was the divine model for human spirituality, with the sexual needs of his followers. In response, a twofold division was created. Those who do not marry and those who marry because they are weak. Where do we find this really expressed? We find it in the Apostle Paul. In 1 Corinthians 7. This is what he says. Now for the matters you wrote about, he's responding. It is good for a man not to marry. But since there is so much immorality, each man should have his own wife, and each woman her own husband. I say this as a concession, not a command. I wish that all men were as I am, which was celibate. But each man has his own gift from God. And this is the origin of the doctrine of celibacy, which will apply to priests and nuns, both of whom are seen as having higher callings in the service of God. In fact, if you ever notice, nuns wear a ring. They're married to Jesus. If you've ever, at least they did traditionally. I haven't been looking at nuns' fingers lately, so. But I knew a number of nuns. I worked in a Catholic school in Australia, girls' school in Australia. So I knew a number of nuns, and they all wore the ring. They all wore the ring. Consequently, sexuality was allowed for the flock, but only within the institution of marriage and essentially for the purpose of procreation and never solely for pleasure. That's why no contraception. It's not for pleasure. It's only for one purpose. This is traditional Catholic doctrine. It's still held. And this is why practices such as coitus interruptus, which you talked about last time, pulling out, or even masturbation, were prohibited and seen as ultimate sins. I think Thomas Aquinas refers to masturbation as the worst of all sins. Why? I know your face. Because he said it's the ultimate in self-love. The ultimate in self. In any case. So this is the vision we have. And so the traditional position by the church was, okay, sex is going to happen. It can only happen in marriage, only for procreation. Those who are stronger will give it up. Those who can't, it's a concession. So, but even then, it was seen as a problem. Here's an early church father by the name of Tertullian, 160 to 220 CE, a bishop. He wrote, in that last breaking wave of delight, do we not feel something of our very soul going from us? He's talking about at the end of the sexual experience. The French have a term for this. It's called le petit mort, the little death. From that high, that's what Tertullian's referring to that. So what's his point? Look at what it is. It's a momentary, and then the moment it's over, you feel. Now, if you also have an institution behind you that's putting in a little guilt there, you can see how that would develop. That was Tertullian. Along the same lines, this bishop, Origen, 185 to 254, he was the bishop of Alexandria, which was a very large early Christian community, took the eunuch verse in Matthew literally and castrated himself. Made himself a eunuch for the kingdom of heaven. Now, if you have leadership doing you can see. In addition, there developed something called Mariology, with its emphasis on the Mother of God's perpetual virginity. Perpetual. It gave psychological support to the idea that any phallic penetration was part of the profane sphere of existence. This is very Gnostic. Matter is evil, essentially. It's a trap. Stay away from it. All it will do is consume you. And there's some truth in that. I mean, if it can become addictive, we know that. Once married, however, a man and a wife should not refuse sex to one another once you're married, since they had given each other power over their own bodies. And Paul says the husband must give his wife her due, and in turn the wife must give her husband his due. The wife cannot claim her body as her own. It is her husband's. But just as equally, the husband cannot claim his body as his own. It is his wife's. But always within marriage and always for procreation. Okay. Now we have to turn to someone who's had a great impact on the notion of sexuality in Christian tradition. Augustine of Hippo. Hippo is a small community in North Africa near Carthage. He was made a bishop. Wrote a very, very famous work known as the Confessions, which has become a classic of Christian theology. When the early history autobiographies, by the way. In this work, he outlines his sinful youth, especially regards sexuality, and then his conversion to Christianity. He was, when he was younger, he is what in Australia they call a lad. He was a real lad. And he had friends, and they were all lads, and they all thought it was great. His mother was a Christian and always feared he was going to hell and put a lot of emphasis on him. So Augustine gets a lot of bad press these days, and you can understand why after what I go. But, I have a little bit of a sense of feeling for this guy. He went through quite a bit. He was very handsome. He was a very good speaker. He taught rhetoric. He went he was in Carthage, where he was raised in North Africa. He later went to Italy, became very close to the bishops there, and was a great speaker, and then had his experience. And in this work, he displays intense sorrow for his sexual sins and writes on the importance of sexual morality. But the overreaching theme of the work is what he calls the natural motion of the spirit from its restlessness of alienation from God to the repose of peace and union with God. He's type of an early mystic as well. This is what he writes. Belatedly I love thee, O beauty so ancient and so new. Belatedly I love thee. For see, I didn't see thou was within, and I was without, and I sought thee out there. I rushed heedlessly among the lovely things thou hast made. Thou didst call and cry aloud, and did force upon my deafness, but didst gleam and shine, and did chase away my blindness. Thou didst breathe fragrant odors, and I drew in my breath, and now I pant only for thee. I tasted, and now I hunger and thirst. Thou didst touch me, and I burned for thy peace. What he's saying, he was trying to find fulfillment in the world, in God's creation, especially women. That's where he was trying to fill that inner gap. And it wasn't working. He'd have that great height and then boom. Yeah. Question.
I was just wondering, in this particular picture, I don't know when that was made, but it just seems kind of different than a lot of the other pictures. I mean, he's in the satin and the pink, and I know pink may not have been as feminine back then
No.
as it is now.
Yeah.
But it just looks shiny and.
Yeah, well, he was a bishop. He became a bishop. He was a bishop, and he became the leading Catholic theologian. His theology dominated for 1,000 years until the time of Aquinas. So let's go into his notion of sin, because it became very, very significant in the history of early Christianity, and it's still in many ways the church, because it is related to sex. For Augustine, sin was not merely an act, it was a condition. Sin is a condition of the soul. It's separation from God. That's what sin is to Augustine. When your soul is separated from the divine, that is sin. And then all the little things you do are the sins. Okay? Sin, with a capital S, is the condition of alienation. And this sin, according to Augustine, began with the fall. Through Adam's disobedience, sin came into being and was passed on to all humanity. And this sin was largely sexual in nature, in his interpretation. According to Augustine's interpretation, Adam had all of humanity within him. Thus, he would say his sin was our sin. You see how this becomes original? Adam's sin is passed down. We have Adam's sin within us. And when Adam sinned, he and humanity were punished by God in both body and soul. The body by death, thus death is the human condition, and the soul by becoming carnal and susceptible to the sinful flesh. Now you got to remember, he's writing out of his own experience here. And if I have any problems with it, I don't mind someone expressing their, if I have any problems, that he universalizes it. He takes it away from just his own situation and says this is everyone's. In any case, the soul's love for God has thus turned to lust for God's created objects. So it's a misdirection of love. We cease to love God and we love his objects. And what's the way we express that is sexually. At least one way. Consequently, it's a form of self-love. After the fall, what moves a person, according to Augustine, is not what he or she knows, but what he or she wants. Desire. And the epitome of this is sexual desire. In other words, he says we're dominated by a will rather than knowledge. Our will is oriented towards self. Everything we do is from the will is usually self-oriented. Okay. And actually, he speculated, it gets kind of out there a bit, speculated on the origin of sexuality, which he maintained before the fall was without sin. So there was sex before the fall, but it wasn't sinful. After the fall, there appeared in both Adam and Eve an intuitive sense of indecency and guilt. So he would explain his sense of guilt as part of what original sin is. This is all passed down somehow sexually from generation to generation. And that's original sin. So it meant at the moment of conception, this stain somehow was passed on to the progeny. And this disjuncture was to be enacted every time a couple had intercourse. So that's why we are all the son of Adam. Now, I should say a little bit about, Augustine was originally a Manichaean. The Manichaean religion came out of Zoroastrianism, which said that there was an evil God and a good God in war with one another. He found that hard to accept. But you can see a little bit of a carryover here, perhaps. That he wanted to explain why his will could not be controlled by himself. It's sort of, if you go to the 12-step programs, one of the basic notions they have is you need more than your will. You have to surrender to. Okay. This comes out of the Augustinian tradition. The will cannot do it. It's too strong. Sexuality is too strong. You can't overcome it by will. You need help. And this is part of this tradition, which again it has been massaged throughout Christian history, but you can see by and large there tends to be a sense of guilt around sex, whereas you don't really find that in Islam or Judaism. Because Muhammad was, Moses, there wasn't any problem. Sexuality was part of being human. But when you take that away somehow, and now you got to bring these two together, in any case. And then unfortunately, can we get to, no. Unfortunately, what a lot of Christian leadership early on did was blame it on Eve. Blame it on Eve. And if Adam is universal man, Eve is universal woman. Listen to what our good friend Bishop Tertullian said. This is to women. In pain you bring forth children. Woman, and you shall turn to your husband, and he shall rule over you. And you do not know that you are Eve? God's sentence hangs still over all your sex, and his punishment weighs down upon you. You are the devil's gateway. That's an interesting gateway, yeah. You are she who first violated the forbidden tree and broke the law of God. This was a bishop. It was you who coaxed your way around him whom the devil had not the force to attack. Who's that? Adam. With what ease you shattered that image of God. Because of the death you merited, even the Son of God had to die. Woman, you are the gate to hell. To counter her dark side, there was always the image of Mary, who became the symbol of purity. So these were the images that young females had to deal with, this dualism. Okay? There's the Eve within you, which is going to lead everyone, especially men, to hell. And then there's Mary, the pure one. The Gospels of Matthew and Luke in the New Testament describe Mary as a virgin. And over time, she was conceived as being free of original sin. That's the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception. Some people, when they hear the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception, think it refers to Jesus. No, it refers to Mary. Mary was born without sin as a counter to Eve. Okay. As a counter to Eve. She was born without sin. Because if she had sin, then her son would be tainted. So she thus became the ideal of motherhood and the image of what a woman should strive to be. So officially, the Council of Ephesus in 431 sanctioned the cult of the Virgin as the Mother of God. So in the 5th century, she was begun to refer to as the Mother of God. And this comes from that council. If anyone does not confess that Christ is God in truth, and therefore that the Holy Virgin is the Mother of God, for she bore in a fleshy way the Word of God become flesh, let him be anathema, which essentially means cast out. This anti-sexual impulse in the church can be seen in the fact that from the 4th to the 10th centuries, there were continual calls to prohibit marriage to the clergy, which was finally accomplished in the 12th century. So it wasn't until the 12th century that priests were celibate. It was this continual call by leadership that this is the role they should. And so at the First Lateran Council in 1123, adopted the following canon. We absolutely forbid priests, deacons, subdeacons, and monks to have concubines or to contract marriage. We decree in accordance with the definitions of the sacred canons that marriages already contracted by such persons must be dissolved and that the person be condemned to do penance. The Eastern Orthodox Church was a little more moderate and allowed priests to be married, although they could not marry after ordination. So if they were married before ordination, they could continue to be married. But if an Orthodox priest were to become a bishop, then his wife had to go to a nunnery. During the Middle Ages, celibacy was supported by the establishment of monasteries for both monks and nuns. A medieval monastery was enclosed, sometimes remote community of monks and nuns led by an abbot or an abbotess. And there were numerous monasteries with different groups. And some were a little more lenient, some were completely enclosed. Once you went in, you never came out. But others were teaching, others were nursing. And then, of course, there was... So members would shun the worldly goods and live a simple life of prayer and devotion. And sex in these monasteries was prohibited, although it happened a lot. There are all sorts of records of it, which makes sense. I mean, you put a bunch of people together and tell them no. So it's something such as so strong, and anyway, the monastery actually first developed about the 4th century in Egypt, and also in Syria in the desert communities, and then they spread into Europe. Perhaps the most famous are St. Francis and St. Clare. If you know the story of St. Francis, who then established his own group of monks, but had to get recognition from the church to be official. It took a while. And St. Clare, who he knew from their life living together in Assisi, she then later became a nun and formed her own monastery. So as already mentioned, according to the official view of the church, procreation was the only legitimate reason for intercourse. and the only natural sexual position was man on top. Later became referred to as the missionary position, if you've ever heard that term. Yeah. To enforce these views, the church had a book of penitentials, a catalog of sins, accompanied by the appropriate punishment for each sin. One of the most serious sins was using the withdrawal method to prevent pregnancy. Those who committed and confessed to this sin were required to fast for a month on water and bread. Those who confessed to having engaged in oral or anal sex was triple. In addition, there was a wide range of laws and proclamations that could restrict when a couple could have sex. For example, no sex on Sunday, because that was the Lord's Day. Also, Thursday and Friday, which were meant to be days preparing for the Eucharist. There were also lengthy periods of abstinence. Lent, 47 to 62 days. Christmas, 35 days. Pentecost, 40 to 60 days. Add them up. Like their Jewish counterparts, Christian mystics, and often women, used very figurative language of the bridal chamber to express their desire for union with their Lord. Okay, whatever impulse you had towards union and desire had to go to God, not to people, if you were a monk or not. Physical sexual imagery was often employed, and you read some of these texts, the mystics spoke of rapture or being engulfed in rapture. Now, just interested, if you're interested in language, it comes from the same root as rape. Rapture. But with the difference being that rapture is the result of the soul's willing consent to total abandonment, while rape is defined as forced sexual submission to the will of another human being. Has anyone ever heard of this lady? She's one of the famous Christian mystics, Teresa of Avila. She had ecstatic visions of an angel. Listen to this one. In his hand, I saw a great golden spear, and at the iron tip there appeared to be a point of fire. This he plunged into my heart several times so that it penetrated to my entrails. When he pulled it out, I felt he took them and left me utterly consumed by the great love of God. Freudians have a field day with this passage. Okay, well, let's move on briefly to the Reformation. Prohibitions against priestly marriage were dropped by most Protestant groups. Martin Luther, who was a former Augustinian monk, would marry a former Benedictine nun, Catherine von Bora. He helped them all come out of the nunnery, and claimed that vows of chastity originated in the heretical delusion that asceticism could win favor with God. Now that's interesting for an Augustinian. He's saying that people use chastity as a way of proving themselves worthy, justification. And he says, whereas God's grace came only through faith. And this is with this powerful notion of grace. Okay? You can't earn God's forgiveness by giving up sex. It'll probably only make it worse for you, for most people. Okay? You have to depend on his grace. This is the very powerful in the Protestant tradition. In this regard, he said, a woman is not created to be a virgin, but to bear children. In Genesis 1, God was not speaking just to Adam, but also to Eve when he said, be fruitful and multiply, as the female sex organs of a woman's body, which God has created for this reason, prove. And this was not just said to one or two women, but to all of them with no exceptions. So he's saying the idea of taking these vows of celibacy by both priests and nuns, it's not biblical. It's tradition. There was also Huldrych Zwingli, whom in 1524 publicly married the widow Anne Reinhard and declared marriage must be lawful for everyone since, and this was important, Scripture nowhere forbade it. But even with such claims, until relatively recent time in the modern period, both Catholic and Protestant leadership taught that sex was primarily for the purpose of procreation. Current Protestant views on contraception are markedly more pluralistic than those expressed by the Catholic Church, due to historical divergences of theological thought that began during the Reformation, and which vehemently rejected an infallible doctrinal authority other than Scripture. If you can't find it in Scripture, then it can't be final. And the various forms of Protestantism as a whole, from the Reformation until 1930, strongly condemned contraception. But finally, in what was known as the Seventh Lambeth Conference of the Anglican Community in 1930, major mainline Protestant denominations shifted their doctrine and accepted contraception. Not all. There are still, especially amongst evangelicals, who do not accept contraception, or what the Catholics called rhythm, the rhythm method. Have you ever heard of that? You try and time it with your, yeah. So a lot of evangelicals, but by and large, the position is contraception. Well, what about the Methodist Church? It holds that, quote, each couple has the right and the duty, prayerfully and responsibly, to control conception according to their circumstances. That's the position of the Methodist Church, which more or less says it's up to you. It's not. It's saying, okay, because circumstances are different. Everyone isn't in the same situation. In its resolution on responsible parenthood, which you've all read, I'm sure, states that in order to support the sacred dimensions of personhood, all possible efforts should be made by parents and the community to ensure that each child enters the world with a healthy body and is born into an environment conducive to realization of his or her potential. That opens a lot of doors. Okay? The first part is with a healthy body. What happens if you find out that the child in your womb is deformed? Okay. Well, if the point is that it should enter the world with a healthy body, that opens up abortion. Okay. And also put more to this to an environment that's conducive to its. So if you have 13 kids and you have the 14th on the way, and that wasn't unusual, so it really opened up. So to this end, the UMC supports adequate public funding and increased participation in family planning services by public and private agencies. So the Methodists are in the forefront of acceptance of contraception, even abortion, although it's not, it opens some possibilities here, because what's to be considered is the condition of the child and the potential of the child. Okay, so before closing, I want to mention there have been several discourses that have countered or deviated in some form from the more orthodox version of Jesus' sexuality. There was an early account of Jesus in his special relationship with Mary Magdalene. It became known among scholars as the Gospel of Mary, which was discovered in 1896 in a 5th century papyrus codex written in Coptic. These were the Gnostic Gospels that we've talked about that were found in Egypt in 1940. They were written in Coptic. Okay? One of these is called the Gospel of Mary. There's some question as to who the Mary was, whether it was actually Mary Magdalene. As the narrative opens, Jesus is engaged in dialogue with his disciples, answering their questions on the nature of matter and the nature of sin. At the end of the discussion, Jesus departs, leaving the disciples distraught and anxious. To soothe their anxiety, Mary speaks up with words of comfort and encouragement. Then Peter asks Mary to share with them any special teaching she received from Jesus. Significantly, Peter says to Mary, "Sister, we know that the Savior has loved you more than the rest of the women." Now, there are no explicit sexual references in this text, but you see how that might feed the belief? You can spin this a bit, of those underground movements who felt the two were physically intimate. So there's always been this sort of underground notion of Magdalene and Jesus. It was always condemned by the Catholic Church, but this group, the Cathars in southern France, held it as one of their doctrines. And the church led a major campaign of extermination, which killed tens of thousands of Cathars. Not just for this belief, but for their overall moving away from the church. 13th century. And even Martin Luther speculated on a possible sexual relationship between the two in his own rejection of celibacy. And then there's probably this one. You know this one. The theme was resurrected by Dan Brown and put into a movie form by Ron Howard, The Da Vinci Code. Okay, so finally there are a few, and this is way left, but you got to mention all the views, have noted that Jesus' primary energy was directed towards his male disciples in the same manner that Socrates related to his students, and that it was erotic. Now, before you get really upset, erotic doesn't necessarily mean sexual, but it doesn't rule it out either. It means eros, which comes from one of the Greek words for love. It's passionate relationship with another. Socrates was said to have had these with his students, especially Alcibiades. In other words, you're not just my student. We're bounded by knowledge. It's a passionate relationship. It's erotic. And so then there have been others who said, well, yeah. So in any case, so that sort of takes us through some of the views of sexuality in terms of the Christian tradition. I think it's fair to say there's often been a lot of guilt associated with sex in the history of Christianity. And a lot of that comes from the foundational beliefs and just the problem of Jesus himself. If Jesus is asexual, why? And what does that mean for me? And Paul always held it to be that's the ideal. You're not capable of it probably. So when you have the ideal, there's a tension underneath it. Fortunately, the Catholic Church had confession. It knew it had to deal with guilt. And it's a very effective way, if people take it seriously. And so in any case, modern Christianity, especially Protestant, has moved away from this. There's not so much guilt involved in it anymore. I can't speak for young people, but it wouldn't surprise me if they're strong in a church, if there's still some of that there, because it's very much part of the tradition. Okay, next week we're going to talk about Hinduism, sexuality in Hinduism, and that should be interesting, if you know the Kama Sutra. Anyway, okay, any questions, thoughts?
Well, I was thinking in the monasteries, one of the things that they taught was that the monks learned to read, and they learned to write,
Yes.
and they learned numbers.
Oh, yeah.
So it would seem to me that if you were someone drawn to that desire for knowledge and for information, that you could choose a monastery as probably the only way you'd get it.
Yeah, and what's interesting is the monasteries were able to keep the classical tradition alive during what is called the Dark Ages. Many of the classical texts, Greek texts, philosophy, were kept in these monasteries. And they were later rediscovered during the Renaissance, came back into the tradition. Yeah. Okay, thanks for coming, and we'll hopefully see you next time.